It's 9 o'clock, so I think I'll get going. Welcome to the Top Tips for Managing Productivity and Workflow. I'm Darren Schreiber, and I'll be your lecturer today. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Exeter in the UK, and my own personal research involves using brain imaging to study how people think about politics. The work I'm presenting today is based off of my experience over the last 20 years both working to develop my own productivity, but also helping students and colleagues developing tools that they can use for improving their productivity and workflow. So where we're going, let's see if I can get the next slide. Nope. What do I do? Okay, where we're going is we'll be talking about knowing your needs, about managing time and emotions, finding flow, that idea of the habit loop, and finding your mission. The first place I wanted to start was with a discussion of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Many of you might be familiar with this literature. Maslow argued that in order to take care of the needs at the top of this pyramid, you need to be working on these things at the very bottom of it. So focusing on basic needs such as food, sleep, water, healthy diets, safe housing, in order to meet psychological needs at the next level, things like respect and esteem, intimacy, close relationships, and then finally at the top of that pyramid, so things like self-fulfillment, transcendence. And one of the things that I've observed quite often in my academic colleagues and my students is a real tendency to abandon that basic level of needs. One of the roles that I have at the University of Exeter is as a senior tutor, which in the UK system means that I am dealing with a lot of the students that are in crisis. And one of the first questions I ask them is just talking through their basic needs. Are they meeting these basic things like getting enough sleep, eating a healthy diet, getting sufficient rest, as a way of setting the healthy foundation so that you can meet the higher needs on this Maslow's hierarchy. One element in that, one of the complexities is the difficulty of priorities. This analogy of a jar being filled with stones, pebbles, and sand and water is often used to describe the issues around priorities. As you can see in the jar on the left, if you put the sand in first and then the smaller pebbles working up to the bigger stones, you have a lot less space in that jar. And so the metaphor here is to suggest that you put in the most important elements into the jar first, the priorities, the basic needs, making sure that those are met so that you can move on to the higher ordered phenomena in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The metaphor here in particular is to focus on these most important and urgent things, these life critical basic skills things, and then working from there higher and higher. This is an adjacent tool to this is called the Eisenhower matrix. And the idea here is that you want to identify among the tasks that you're working on the differences between the urgent and important tasks, and identifying which tasks are important, which tasks are not as important, and which tasks are urgent and not as urgent, and taking action on the ones that are urgent and important while simultaneously taking other actions, such as things like planning for the things that are important but they're not urgent, delegating the things that are urgent but not as important, and if at all possible, eliminating the things that are neither urgent or important. A lot of this has been described in the work by Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is a multi-million, 30 million copies sold, was on the bestseller list for over 20 years. And in this, he talks about the first 3 habits being proactive, beginning with the end in mind, and the first things first as a sort of victory over self, as a way of managing your own productivity on the individual level. And then the next 3 habits being habits of interdependence. So enabling you to think win-win, seeking first to understand other people and then to be understood, looking for points of synergy. This is a term that was probably overused in the wake of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But the idea that you should be looking for opportunities where you and other people can collaborate to produce something better than you could do individually or just in a mere combination. And then finally, echoing the idea in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the idea of sharpening the saw, the idea that you take care of these fundamental basic things that allows you to develop and grow as an individual. An opposite approach to this has been kind of working from, instead of from the big picture, beginning with the end in mind, top-down approach of being proactive and beginning with the end in mind, the large picture stuff. A response to that was another alternative book called Getting Things Done, in which the author is asking you in a series of processes to think about what is your next action item. Instead of focusing on the metaphysical, finding your mission or developing a sense of purpose, David Allen's approach of getting things done is really looking at what is the very next thing you need to do. And a lot of people in the productivity world, in life hacking, et cetera, have advocated kind of using both of these techniques kind of from the bottom up and the top down together to be able to develop a sense of how to manage your time, how to manage your priorities, and figure out what your, both what your next action item is, but making sure that those next actions are leading you to a place where you want to be. And we'll talk about how to think about that over the next number of slides. This generation of work and productivity management was often focused on time management as a key concept of how do we exercise efficacy within, given a certain clock and calendar, and the idea of trying to manage time effectively being the core consideration. But a lot of research has developed about procrastination, suggesting that it's really much more about emotion management rather than time management, that one of the main things that's driving the behaviors around procrastination and work avoidance is really being driven by emotional needs rather than simply inefficiencies in how one schedules a day's calendar. And this is described by a literature talking about HALT, using this as a quick mnemonic to be able to identify elements that are triggering you to have stress, triggering you to want to avoid the things that are difficult or challenging or that bring up complicated emotions. And again, referring to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you can see that echoed in the idea of HALT, of triggers being when you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. A lot of times in English, we describe the concept of hangry, the anger that comes about just because you're hungry. And being able to identify what your personal stress triggers are can be an incredibly effective way of understanding what your basic needs are, so that you can manage those basic needs, the emotions that are developing from them, and move towards these higher levels of Maslow's pyramid, the realization of doing work that you really value and the things that you really care about. Having realized, when I was in my 20s, I was hanging out with my mom once and we were at a grocery store and I was quite grumpy and she said, "Are you tired or are you hungry or both?" And I looked at her just like, "What?" And she said, "Yeah, you're grumpy. You're only ever tired since you've been a kid when you're hungry or tired." And this was in my 20s. I'd never had this realization that these things were just such obvious triggers for me, and that I was just consistently, that's when I was grumpy. Over the years, I developed a series of tools that I call my self-care plan, to figure out what are the things that help me to take care of me, to meet those bottom levels of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in order to be able to do the things that I want to do, that I care about most, and that are of greatest value to me and consistent with my mission. One thing I developed along the way was as part of my self-care plan was a recipe for smoothies that's evolved over the course of 10 or 20 years to have a balance of make sure I get enough water, to make sure I get enough proteins. It has spinach in it, it has fruits, it has grains. And so with one simple smoothie that I have pre-made and stored in my refrigerator, can just basically add water to it and put it in the blender, store it in the freezer, and I can just throw water in it. Within a few minutes, I can very often get myself from that place where I'm not feeling so great to feeling much better. And this is consistent with the idea of contrary action, where if you've identified a trigger, something like hunger as being a consistent trigger, identifying a contrary action that will enable you to ameliorate that condition, to be able to counterbalance whatever else is going on. I sometimes describe this as my smoothie test, that if I'm feeling off kilter, if I'm feeling upset about something, I will make one of these smoothies, because about 80% of the time, that sense of frustration, etc., will go away as soon as I've finished my smoothie. And it's fairly embarrassing, somebody who thinks of themselves as, I'm an academic and I live in my head a lot and I imagine I have this world of ideas. And yet again, Maslow's idea and insight of these really basic needs not being met. Once I've had that smoothie, my mind opens up. A lot of times, the things that were upsetting me at the particular moment turn out to evaporate. If they don't, that's also a trigger that allows me to recognize that this is an issue that's going to take a bit more time and energy to identify and resolve and to work through whatever it is that's causing me that emotional blockage or that emotional upset. Another part of the toolkit that I use is a set of tools on managing your anxiety. And I've given this lecture for a number of years based off of my experiences working with undergrads that were at elite institutions and that were processing a lot of anxiety around their academics. And in particular, one case, a young woman walked into my office and she said that she was having trouble with a particular question in stats, and I explained it one way, and then I explained it another way, and then I explained it another way. And she just went into full panic mode and started spiraling a bit and was extremely, extremely stressed that she wasn't able to understand this thing. She said, I'm a top student. I've always gotten A's. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I can't figure this out. And there was this I could see this spiral going on. And I had a line of undergrads going out the door, 20, 30 students that I had to help also in the office hour that I had. I didn't know what to do because I had tried everything I could to help her work through this and understand the stats problem. And I just said, why don't you take a few deep breaths? And she just went and basically started hyperventilating. I suggested, well, instead of that, why don't we do some slow diaphragmatic breathing? And I'll show you a slide on that shortly, and model that behavior. And she said, oh, I understand, never mind, and walked out the office. It turned out that really what was going on is she had triggered herself into this full-on fight or flight mode that indicated, because she was a very competent student, very capable of doing the work that was in front of her, but having hit something that was a little difficult, started a set of cognitive and behavioral spirals that led to greater levels of emotional intensity. So the ideas of this managing your anxiety framework come out of, that I'm taking here, come out of the Army Combat Stress Manual. And the idea is that that evolutionarily, your body is responding to stress mechanisms that have been around for a very, very, very long time. We can see in laboratory experiments, when you look at single cell organisms, if you put a single cell organism on a slide and you have it under a microscope and you have it move through a gradient of salt and saline, you can see signs of physiological stress, even in single cellular organisms, as they're reacting to the challenges of the environment that they're in. And the ancientness of this system means we have a very predictable set of physiological reactions that are the coping mechanisms for dealing with stress that make sense in that evolutionary environment where, perhaps as in this slide, you're being chased by a bear. So imagine you're being chased by a bear. You want your muscles to tense up. You want to be able to potentially fight that bear or to run away from that bear. And this manifests itself in tension in your shoulders or neck, in your back. I get a little eye twitch sometimes, and I realized after a while that that's the check engine light on Darren. If I had a little muscular twitch in my eye, I became grateful for that because it was a recognition that I had some anxiety that perhaps I wasn't fully aware of, that tiny little muscle twitch. Digestive symptoms. Again, if you're being chased by a bear, your body doesn't want to be processing all of the metabolic energy to be taking care of digesting food, which is really metabolically expensive, but it will often evacuate. So people under high stress can tend to vomit or to pass food very quickly through their bowels. I had a friend a number of years ago that was in law school and was basically malnourished, had gone into the doctor, couldn't understand what was wrong. And the doctor said, your body is just not digesting any of the food. It's simply passing through you as a result of you being under such constant stress, that those digestive symptoms that are functional in the condition of being chased by a bear, but aren't in the functional in the context of dealing with persistent stress around work or around writing or around teaching. Circulatory and respiratory stress symptoms are often also quite prevalent. So if you're being chased by a bear, your body will start to constrict the flow of blood through the blood vessels. Is a healthy response in order to, if you get bit by the bear, you don't want to bleed out. And this ability to shut down the capillaries allows you to conserve your body in the core of your blood in the core of your body, which is, again, very functional. But it can lead to things like hyperventilation. It can lead to faster heart rhythms. A very common exercise that's used is a test. You can put a fingertip temperature sensor, and as you do progressive relaxation techniques that I'll describe in a second, you can observe over the course of time the body's core temperature meeting out towards your fingertips. And so when you get very, very relaxed, your body temperature will get close to, I think in Celsius, it's 37, in Fahrenheit, 98.6. And doing this exercise when I was a graduate student in a stress reduction class, seeing my own fingertip temperature go from fairly warm to basically almost the temperature of a core temperature in just a series of minutes as you do these progressive relaxation exercises. Sleep difficulties also are a common symptom of stress. Excessive sleep, difficulty falling asleep, restless sleep, nightmares, all of these are responses, again, to that sense that you're being chased by a bear. Emotional issues, irritation, explosive anger, low energy level, social withdrawal, substance abuse, and suicide. The first time I gave this lecture when I was at UC San Diego, a student came up to me and told me that one of their classmates had committed suicide. And I tell my students when I give them a lecture, I give a series of mini lectures throughout the semester on these tools, and students have been very appreciative of those over the years. And the first time I gave it, a student had indicated that there was a suicide in their class, and the intense pressure that many students are feeling can create these incredibly traumatic emotional responses. And we want to be aware of what those are, both in ourselves, and I tell my students one of the important things is also to recognize these in your peers and in your colleagues, to be able to identify these, especially if they are looking like they're in significant distress, getting them to professional resources as an important adjunct to this. So that they can see student psychological services at the university or develop other tools, as well as developing other tools that will help them. But recognizing these symptoms of stress in ourselves and others, I have found to be very valuable. The cognitive consequences of being chased by a bear is your brain shifts in the ways that it's processing information. It makes a lot of sense if you're working on a dissertation, if you're working on your next book project or a deep research question, to spend a lot of time cogitating about the big picture, seeing the forest and understanding how things are fitting together. But when you're being chased by a bear, the impulse for very important evolutionary reasons is to focus your mind on the next tree. So we see slowing reaction times, difficulty sorting priorities, difficulty starting routine tasks, excessive concern with minor issues, preoccupation with familiar tasks and details to the point of being pointless, indecision, memory impairments, inhibition of long-term memory formation, learning impairments, reduced decision-making skills, and short attention spans. Some fascinating research on this came about from studying fruit flies. So in early days of genetics, they were doing some studies where they were taking fruit flies that they were trying to figure out which fruit flies, what were the genetic correlates of memory and the ability to form long-term memory. So they studied these fruit flies. They had some of them fly towards banana smell or a strawberry smell, and they would either get a reward or they'd get a mild, painful zap as a painful stimulus. And then they looked to see which fruit flies were able to remember that this smell was correlated with this stimuli, and either painful or pleasurable, and eventually bred generation after generation of fruit flies that had really good memories for this and fruit flies that had really poor memories. And it turned out that the gene that was correlated with this ability to form memories was also an analog of the gene that in humans is functioning to enable us to develop a neurotransmitter that's involved in stress. And so they were really surprised, like, why does cortisol, this stress hormone, as it was known at the time, have anything to do with memory? And it turns out that that has been preserved evolutionarily from our common ancestors with the fruit flies to the present day, where we adjust the way that we're processing information and storing information into long-term memory based on our stress and anxiety levels. And that there's this interplay. The hippocampus, a part of the brain that basically, if this is your brainstem and your eyeballs are here, your hippocampi lay above the brainstem in the center of the brain. The hippocampi are part of a key element of forming long-term memories. And in individuals who don't have a functioning hippocampus, they basically live continuously in the present. They have no ability to form new long-term memories. And the cortisol levels will alter the ability to form those long-term memories through the hippocampus. So when you're very stressed, you'll have this difficult time forming those long-term memories. Quite often, students are told they should take a break every 20 minutes, and we'll talk about that again shortly when I talk about the Pomodoro Technique. But they're never told why, and one of the reasons to do that is because it allows your stress levels, your cortisol levels, to decline, facilitating the encoding of information into that long-term memory. A lot of students will report that they'll cram for an exam and then wake up the next morning, and many of you may have experienced this. Usually when I am teaching this in a classroom, I'll ask kind of hands-up surveys, how many of you experience these kind of symptoms? And very often students have experienced, they've worked really hard on something, they've studied a ton, and then the next day it's just seemingly gone. And that again is because of this relationship between the hippocampus function. The ability to encode information to long-term memory requires that we have this lower level of anxiety. So identifying these symptoms and understanding the physiology of stress and why it is adaptive that we react to the chasing of the bear by not thinking about the forest, but thinking tree by tree by tree. Having this emotional intensity can drive adrenaline, et cetera. Not falling asleep when you're being chased by a bear, having fast respiration, et cetera. All of these are functional in an evolutionary context, but can be dysfunctional when we're dealing with the difficulties that we encounter in our lives as academics. Another key set of results, this is over 100 years old, is a set of work by Yerkes and Dodson where they showed that the level of arousal increases. As the level of arousal increases, the performance generally does as well. And so the way that I like to teach about this is, imagine you're moving beans into a cup. And so you've first woken up in the morning and your task is to move beans into a cup, and you're kind of slowly lagging along, moving these beans very slowly because your arousal level isn't very there. But as you get more and more alert, you're able to do this, more quickly. Maybe you've had your first cup of coffee and you're quite quick, and you've had a second cup of coffee, you're even faster. But if you've had your, fifth or sixth cup of coffee, or maybe you've started using some intense stimulants like, say, meth, your ability to function, even at those basic tasks, will crash. And many of us have experienced those sensations where we're overstimulated. I couldn't drink coffee until I was in my 40s because I tended to be a fairly intense kind of baseline level person, and a lot of energy, which was great. But it meant that if I had just even a cup of coffee or a couple of cups of coffee, I could be overstimulated and have difficulty with those with performance on tasks. What is really interesting here, though, in the Yerkes-Dodson curve, and that I think a lot of my students find fascinating, is that the peak performance level on what Yerkes and Dodson found is at a much lower level of arousal for complicated tasks. So to illustrate this, I'll often have a student that I know who has done who's seen me give this lecture before, start to write a haiku, and I'll kind of yell drill instructor style while they try to write just a 575 line poem, this Japanese style known as a haiku. Doing anything cognitively complex when you're under intense pressure is extremely difficult. And the ability to perform on tasks that require especially complex cognition, like the work that we're doing as academics, requires much, much lower levels of arousal. The dysfunctionality that happens for many students who have been trained over years of relatively simple tasks as students is that they rely, and quite often students will rely on develop an adrenaline junkie cycle where they'll require higher and higher and higher levels of arousal in order to perform, because their body's becoming used to the higher levels of stimulants that they have, either through adrenaline or cortisol or caffeine, or just external deadlines, waiting until the very last minute in order to prepare the task. And that level of arousal that is enabling them to do the task is functional on those easy tasks. But when you convert to doing tasks that are more difficult, what they will find when they get to university is that same strategy of just kind of revving up, of waiting to the last minute, of putting all of that added pressure, instead causes their performance to decline very rapidly in a way that's really surprising. So again, Yerkes and Dodson would suggest to reduce that level of arousal. So some of the techniques that we can use to do that include basically contrary action to those physiological symptoms of stress that we were talking about just a couple slides ago. So things like deep breathing, muscular relaxation, and cognitive exercise are recommended to be able to do contrary action to that physiological sense of stress. The Army Combat Stress Manual recommends that you have two tools ready for anxiety management. I think the parallels work really well for us as academics. And for our students as well. One is a tool that's having a category of tools that's useful for when you're on the job, when you're in the moment and something is coming about. You don't have much time to deal with all of the other adjacent issues, but you just need a simple tool to shift you from being in that high stressed, high arousal state into a lower arousal state. There are versions of each of these different techniques that can be used when you're in the midst of something. If you're taking, for undergrads, if they're taking an exam, if you're about to give a talk that's making you nervous, or a job talk. And then secondly, a category, a version of these techniques that's useful for deeper relaxation. When you have some additional time and you're perhaps getting ready to brainstorm about a new research project, or to try and interpret the patterns that you're finding in data and want to have some deeper insights, having the deep relaxation version of this for when you're at home, when you're safe. The military uses these as kind of like when you're in combat and when you're at your home base and you're safe. The deep breathing techniques, again, the technique I was advocating with this statistics student who was having difficulty, moving your diaphragm in and out, diaphragmatic breathing, slow, deep breaths where you're pulling air to the bottom of your stomach. One way that I was taught this was, imagine putting a box of tissues on your stomach and pushing that box of tissues up as you're taking a deep breath, breathing in with your gut so that the air is taken in all the way. This is not the typical way that we breathe, and physiologically what happens is you're telling your body that I'm in a state of relaxation, I'm in a safe place where I can afford to do this kind of slow, deep breathing, and the nervous system just shifts very, very quickly in response to that deep breathing technique. A second one is muscular relaxation. So a quick version is to clench your fists. You can all try this with me. Start clenching your fists, start clenching your arms, start clenching your biceps and your shoulders, and your neck and your face. And as you clench your gut and your toes and get everything super tight, and then let it go. And I don't know if it's as visible on the Zoom screen, but when I do this in class, I get almost an instantaneous laughter reaction from my students because my face turns really red and then it goes a little bit white as I've compressed all of the blood out of my core and then relaxed into my core and then relaxed and it develops this instantaneous relaxation response. You can even feel just a little bit like almost like a high from the instantaneous relaxation that happens from intentionally clenching your muscles and then letting them go. Again, this idea of the contrary action along with it. Similarly, cognitive exercises, things like positive self-talk. The version that's recommended is not just merely like the sort of meaningless things, but really saying things that you believe are true and accurate reflections that emphasize the positive qualities or the successes perhaps that you've had. Imagining a safe place, visualizing a place that's relaxing can be quite useful. Rehearsal by imagining successful accomplishment of the task under pressure. So visualizing through the task that you're working on or the thing that you're about to perform and working through mentally, visually what the process would look like as you're successful, how that would take place. And then finally, meditation. And I'll focus on that just for a minute. A particular technique of mindfulness is known as mindfulness meditation. Another category is sort of the emptying your mind approaches like Zen meditation. Those can be quite useful for just basically clearing the boards, emptying your mind in order to allow a lot of clarity from the emptiness. In the mindfulness approach, you're intentionally focusing your mind on particular body sensations, sounds, etc. One technique that's quite commonly taught, there's a standardized curricula, 8-week curricula that's been used in a series of scientific studies, including a number of brain imaging studies. And this 8-week meditation course, one of the first things you do is doing these mindfulness meditation that's a body scan. And so simply feeling your toes. I mean, when was the last time you thought about how your toes are feeling? Noticing the sensations. Are they cold? Are they warm? Are they tense? Are your toes relaxed? Do you have any feelings in your toes? What sensations are present in your toes moving to your feet, to your arches, to the ankles, up to your calves, and mindfully positioning yourself as you are mentally going through one part of the body after another and just noticing what sensations are there, allowing those sensations to just be present and to relax. The research on mindfulness is extraordinary. A lot of research has been done in terms of its implications for health outcomes, for stress reduction, for a number of positive benefits. I've been doing different types of meditation for over 20 years and have really found it has calmed a lot of things. One very apt description I heard of meditation early on was that meditation was like being locked in a closet with a lunatic that had a megaphone. And of course, complicated corollary of that is that like you're the lunatic, that's your megaphone, and those thoughts that are kind of coming up, all of those intense emotional or cognitive reactions to the stresses that we're feeling can come up when we meditate. And being able to not push them down and shut them off, but rather noticing them, allowing them to be present and letting them go is at the core of mindfulness meditation, being able to be mindful of those things, noticing them, but not letting them dominate us or causing us to ruminate or excessively focus on those things. An app that I have found incredibly useful, and a lot of people have as well, I just was reading about how they've now got $1 billion in valuation on the market, is an app called Calm. And if you're wanting to get an easy introduction to meditation, Calm has a series of intro meditations you can do. And I think I can't remember how much it is per month for a subscription, but it's one of these things I found so valuable. I ended up getting a lifetime subscription recently because it is a tool that I can use on a regular basis. And they have meditations that are as short as 3 minutes, all the way up to hour-long meditations. And they have daily meditations that they're generating way more content than I'd ever be able to get to. And content developed for particular things. The sleep meditation, I have found now, my brain, just because and we'll talk about the habit loop very shortly, my brain is so hardwired that as soon as I hear the voice of the sleep meditation playing, I'm almost asleep instantly after that. So I highly recommend this as a way of getting into mindfulness meditation, and a very gentle introduction with just tons of material. The daily meditations that it provides are about 10 minutes and a perfect amount that you can find time for in your schedule. Another concept I wanted to introduce was the idea of finding flow. So Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi is one of the founders of the positive psychology movement. He and Martin Seligman had noticed that a huge amount of work in psychology was focused on negative things. It was focused on negative emotions, on anxiety or dysfunction or stress, all the things we've been talking about thus far. And Csikszentmihalyi and Seligman got interested in looking at what can make us more functional, what can make us happier. And part of his research here was driven actually by a methodological concern that a lot of psychology was working on studies that were done in laboratories with college undergraduates and that had a real external validity problem. So he started giving people pagers that they could be buzzed at a random time, and they were asked then to write down what they were thinking, what they were feeling, who they were with, and what they were doing, and to track these basic things in their life so that they could get a random sample across a much more diverse set of people in the real world as they were living their daily lives of what are you doing, what are you thinking, what are you feeling, how do you, who are you with, what's the environment that you're in. And in that massive amount of data, through this inductive approach with this data, what he discovered was a pattern where people were most likely to report positive emotions, positive affect around instances where they were facing a very, very high challenge that they were very, very skilled at. And this was quite surprising because it wasn't something that they had been looking for in the data, but that it just came out of their analyses, and the patterns were quite robust, that people were most likely to have these very strong positive emotions when they were doing things that were very difficult, but that they were very skilled at. And this led to a whole series of studies trying to follow up and understand what was going on with it, what were the characteristics. Some of the phenomena that they identified with flow were things like a tendency to be very focused in the moment, to lose track of time and space, to be performing in a way that was not fully consciously aware, that people were able to do tasks and then on reflection be surprised that they were able to do some of those things because their level of performance was even much higher than they were expecting it to be. They creative insights, etc., developing during this. And he developed a series of metrics that he could use to figure out how much flow a person generally had. Many academics have a lot of flow in their life, which is really great news, I think, for us. And you might think about what are the moments that you've had where you have experienced flow that characterized by being so engrossed in the task that you're in that you lose track of the time that you're working on it, where maybe the sun has started rising, you've been working on a paper, you've been doing some data analysis, and all of a sudden you see the sun is rising because you've been so engrossed in that task. That element of losing track of self in the sense of time and space is very characteristic of flow. And he also identified that quite often people will have phenomena like anxiety when they're facing a challenge that is very high, but their skills aren't addressed to that. They'll feel apathy, so they're at their low skill level and a low challenge. He gave examples of how people could adapt to this. He gave examples of people working at a shop where they were folding sweaters and started having this kind of mindless routine of kind of folding these sweaters repetitively again and again and again and again. And in order to deal with the boredom of that, people who were there started to have competitions to see who could fold the sweaters fastest and stack them up most quickly, developing artificial challenges for a task that wasn't intrinsically complicated, developing routines with that such that they would build more and more challenges that would increase the level of skill that they were having, with this feedback loop that they became in the zone, in the flow state, even though the task itself was relatively monotonous, relatively simple cognitively, but because they were pushing their challenge to a higher and higher level, trying to get faster and faster at this, developing more ability and getting themselves into that positive emotional state of flow. Haile Csikszentmihalyi gave an example of an individual working at a factory where there was a minute to assemble widget A and widget B, and the individual in that had just started seeing how quickly he could put widget A and widget B together. He'd been working at this job feeling kind of dead end, and as he got better and better and better at that, he started realizing he was enjoying the work that he was doing, but it was also leaving him more space because he had a minute to put widget A and widget B together. And over the time, as he started basically getting his time down to just 30 seconds assembling widget A and widget B, he had then 30 seconds to kind of think about the rest of his life and what he wanted to do, and very quickly realized that that wasn't what he wanted to do, and use that extra time to make plans to get out of that job and to find something that he found more rewarding. Linus Pauling was one of the individuals who had the highest metric of flow, according to Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's measurements. But another individual, and maybe it's not surprising somebody's gotten a couple Nobel Prizes, would be this person who's working at this very high challenge, very high skill intercept. I tell my students, if you're feeling stress about things, maybe one solution is to increase your skills. If you're feeling bored with the work you're doing, again, to increase the skills or the challenge that you're facing. One of my goals as a teacher is to give my students work that is going to address them at every level of challenge, so that they have an opportunity to become more, to develop more experience with this finding flow, positive emotions that can develop from having very high challenges and very high skill levels. Video games are built with the same logic. You'll notice that if you play a video game, the very first level is very simple, low skills. And as you get higher and higher through the video games, the people who develop video games are very aware of this research on finding flow. They want to keep people engrossed in that positive, intense, emotional space of high productivity and that feeling of accomplishment that comes with it by increasing the level of difficulty as the participant is increasing their level of skill along with it. So we want to use the insights that are developed from this research to figure out how do we increase the challenge of the tasks that we're doing and increase our skills relative to those challenges. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi gives, in addition to Linus Pauling, another example of a guy working at a factory that was hired originally as a repairman at the factory, and his job was fixing the boilers. And this guy had a flow score that was just as high as Linus Pauling's, and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi was a bit surprised by this, came and met this individual, saw what his work life was like. He had started working on the boilers, gotten those running once he'd gotten those all going, he realized that, sometimes the trucks that were being used for deliveries needed repairs, and he figured, yeah, well, I can learn that. And so again, setting a new challenge, a new task to focus on, and increasing his skills along with that. And year after year after year, as new things and new challenges kept coming up, new things that need to be repaired, this guy kept working on each one of those new challenges, constantly finding something new for him. When they got copy machines, he learned how to fix the copy machines. And when Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi went to interview his colleagues, everybody said, yeah, our factory would shut down tomorrow if we didn't have him here, because he keeps the whole thing running. He's able to take all of these pieces, put them together, and we don't have to hire a copy repair person or somebody to work on the trucks, or somebody to do, install the next internet software. This guy has just figured out over the course of decades how to make all of these things keep running. So then he's curious, okay, is there any work-life balance? What's going on in this guy's personal life? He goes to his house, which was in a fairly impoverished neighborhood with a vacant lot next door to it. And he finds that the vacant lot has been repurposed, all of the rubble piled up in one corner, looking something like a kind of man-made mountain, planted with bigger plants in the front, leading to smaller and smaller, with a forced perspective effect, making it look like a mountain range that has smaller and smaller trees on it. He's installed a waterfall that's dripping down in this vacant lot that he doesn't even own. It's just the property next to him that had been abandoned. And then he put a mister in it to create clouds of mist that would hang around this mountain range that he'd created, with then a light beaming through it to create a rainbow arcing over the waterfalls, over this mountain in this abandoned lot that otherwise would have just been rubble like the other abandoned lots in his neighborhood. This high flow individual looking constantly for those places where he can find new challenges and developing that positive emotion that come with that. In some other work on the habit loop, amalgamating a lot of academic research, Charles Duhigg published this work looking at this habit loop. How do we get our brains to develop habits? And the idea here is that we need a cue, a kind of signal that says, okay, switch into automatic mode, a routine, the thing that we're doing when once we've been triggered by that cue, and then a reward that happens afterwards. We develop a lot of these because these mechanisms for this habit loop have been, again, present in us physiologically for very, very long times. This is the kind of the techniques that are used to train rats or pigeons. These are very evolutionarily well-established mechanisms to have a signal, to have a behavior, either a routine, kind of either emotional, behavioral, cognitive, and then a payoff for it. We know the dopaminergic circuits are involved with this. Some of the details we're still, even after all these years, haven't nailed down. But the idea is, in order to break habits, we want to identify where the vulnerabilities in the habits that we don't want anymore. So people who smoke, for instance, will often recognize that they have a trigger, a cue that is making them want to start grabbing a cigarette. Or perhaps you're feeling stressed when you're doing work and you want to go, your routine then is to look on Facebook. And the payoff that we get is either the nicotine, or perhaps on Facebook, we see that there's some likes. Again, software companies are very, very aware of these habits and build software around to reinforce these. So we may be looking for moments where we can disrupt these habits. We might also want to develop new habits, and being aware of how this habit loop functions, how again, this very ancient neurophysiological responses to stimulus and response mechanisms, and the cycle that comes around with that can be very effective as a way of building new habits. One habit that I really have found effective is the Pomodoro Technique. And the Pomodoro Technique was developed by Francesco Cirillo in the 1970s. And there's a ton of apps you can find on your phone or on your computer that will enable you to do this. It's based off of the Pomodoro. Part of it comes off of the Italian word for tomato. And so it's reflecting one of those tomato-shaped kitchen timers. And the idea is that you start off by deciding on what task you want to be working on. So in going back to the David Allen stuff, what is my next action item? What's the next thing that I need to be focusing on? Identifying a specific task that you can do and writing that down. Setting a timer, the typical Pomodoro is 25 minutes. I find 20 minutes works a little bit better for me. Setting a timer for 20 minutes, working on that task until the timer rings. And one of the key things, and this is related to both mindfulness meditation and the habit loop, is you'll have a tendency, most of us have a tendency when we're doing work to get distracted. We think, oh, I should go check Facebook, or I want to go to the bathroom, or I want to get a drink of water. We have all of these intrusive thoughts that come in. Once we're trying to focus on something, lots and lots of other thoughts start coming in. And the tendency is to respond in a reactive way. Again, as Stephen Covey says, be proactive. Being proactive in this moment means then focusing your attention on that task for the 20-25 minute timer period that you've set. Every time your brain goes wandering off into something, bringing it right back down. Again, a key principle of mindfulness. You know that your mind is going to go off to other places. If you're doing a body scan and you start feeling the feelings in your thighs, you start thinking about, oh, there's sore from the workout I did, and then all of a sudden your brain is going off to thinking about how you're going to go working out tomorrow. Bringing your mind back to the tasks that you're focusing on. What happens eventually, and my experience with this and many of the students I've worked with have found that eventually your mind just stops wandering so much. It starts getting into that focus period. You start much more quickly I used to have the realization that I could sometimes go in and out. I could have moments where I'd be hyper-focused and really be able to be effective, and then other times where my brain was just wandering all over the place. Now, once I set the Pomodoro going, the trigger, the cue of, and the app that I have says, ready, set, go. And that cue triggers then my routine, which is I'm going to work on whatever task I've identified for the next 20 minutes. Every time another thought comes into my mind, I'm going to refocus back on that task, staying with that task for that 20-minute period. And then there's a reward. And the reward in, again, that habit loop circle is the reward of the task timer being done. Now, what many of my students have reported is they start doing this, they're like, oh, I can work for way more than 20 minutes. This is really great. The key bit of this Pomodoro technique is every time that thought of, oh, I want to get a drink of water, oh, I want to check Facebook comes in, cognitively, you're going to tell yourself, I can get a drink of water at the end of the 20-minute period. I can choose to get to use Facebook at the end of 20 minutes. I can choose to call my friend back at the end of 20 minutes. I can choose to go for a run at the end of 20 minutes. So the key here is then to reinforce that promise that you've said to yourself of taking a break at the end of that 20-minute period. The stopping, it turns out, is just as important for this habit loop function as the doing the work itself, because your brain, having said to your brain, hey, you can take a drink of water and decide if you want to do that at the end of 20 minutes. If you break that promise, it's going to disrupt the habit loop. So at the end of the 20 minutes, you then get to spend a minute to think through. I do a 1-minute break between my 20-minute Pomodoros just so that I can keep some of the momentum going rather than 5 minutes. But my 1-minute break, during that, I allow myself to think, okay, is there something else I need to do? Should I go to the toilet? Should I get some more water? Should I call a friend? Do I need to respond to that email? Do I need to just write a list of the other things I need to do so I can get them out of my head and let that out of my mind? There was a survey a number of years ago at the Lifehacker blog. I think after the Lifehacker blog had been around for 10 years. This is a website that is focused on productivity and how to work more effectively. And they asked their readership what was the most effective tool that they had come upon in their productivity. The Pomodoro Technique was number one. I think it was recommended by like 30% of the readership. So if you think of, a decade worth of discussion about productivity, one technique stood so far above the rest, and that was the Pomodoro Technique. Highly recommended. It takes a while to get used to it. One of the other things I would caution is you'll get so productive with it that it's very easy to burn out. And I think you want to spend a particular attention to, again, going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what is your basic need? How many Pomodoros can you do? I find that if I'm doing 6 Pomodoros a day of writing, that's enough. If I end up doing many more than that, I will very quickly hit into burnout. I can do 6 every day. I can do basically 2 hours of academic writing a day continuously, and it's not going to be exhausting. But it's the equivalent of running a marathon. You're not going to be able to run a marathon every day, but being able to find that balance for yourself of how many Pomodoros you can do effectively, and recognizing if you feel burned out the next day or the day after to drop that number down. I have found this technique to be incredibly effective. And again, once I hit my trigger, once I hear that ready, set, go trigger from my computer, my mind zooms into that high flow state almost immediately. And that has just been really, really beneficial for my academic writing and creativity and reducing my stress, because I know as soon as I hit that button, I'm ready to go. So I wanted to move towards the conclusion with talking about finding your mission. This is a lecture I give at the end of every one of my undergraduate talks. And I've done, again, that for 20 years until I came upon a study that was showing that having students think about their mission for 10 minutes at the beginning of a course is enough to dramatically increase grades and academic performance over the course of in a randomized controlled trial. And so now I have my students on the very first day of class think about why they are there taking that course, have them journal for 5 minutes about that. and then ask a few students to share that with the class. Why are they in that class? Because the research on positive emotion, on the core work in positive psychology, which again, we'll get back to a little bit at the very end, suggests that having a sense of purpose, to have a sense of mission with the work that you're doing is incredibly important. So the research on expertise, I think it was Erickson had done the core work in here. They looked to see what were natural born prodigies like. Well, and it turned out they couldn't really find any. There was very difficult to identify individuals who had sort of like an innate capacity to do whatever the task it was. This became known, the key point of this research became known as it was translated by Malcolm Gladwell as the 10,000 hours rule. It turns out it's a lot more complicated than that. And there's some great books, again, the work by Erickson, his original research is really interesting to read because he gives lots and lots of examples. But basically what he found was that there is a non-linear relationship. As you get better and better, as you get more and more practice, you get better and better at the task, but it goes in a non-linear curve. The very first time you start doing something, you have dramatic improvements. I started learning Hungarian many years ago, and of course, in the first year, I made dramatic improvements because I didn't know any Hungarian, and by the end of the year, I could recognize a few hundred words. It's an insanely difficult language, and 8 years later, my performance is still terrible, but I put the hours in, and you can see improvements in skill going up and up and up. And as you once you get to a much higher level, though, the differences in the returns become much more subtle, but the performance continues to increase. There's a continuous gradation of increase. And quite often, people who are at the elite performance level have about 10,000 hours of practice. That's roughly 5 years of 40 hours a week if you were to map that out. The suggestion is you can get to a very sophisticated level with it. A great book illustrating this, psychologist wrote a book called Guitar Zero, in which he basically used his sabbatical to learn how to play guitar and to write a book about learning. And so he took all of the research in psychology about how to learn, how to develop expertise using this kind of work, including the things I'm going to talk about here, the ideas of flow, etc., and practice. And by the end of the year, he was a very competent guitarist. And the audiobook version, he's playing music at the beginning of every chapter. And he's much better guitarist than I am, and I've been playing for 25 years, but crucially, without those thousands of hours of practice. I just kind of noodle along. So the 3 elements of deliberate practice are, first, setting specific goals. Again, returning to that idea of having a goal, having a specific task in mind. 2, getting immediate feedback, working with a teacher who's going to give you feedback while you're playing, or listening to the music, comparing what you were playing to the music you're trying to play. And concentrating as much on technique as on outcomes. One of the issues that I see quite often with students is they want the outcome, but it's difficult to get them to focus on the technique, the process by which they're preparing to study for exams, the tools that they're using for that, the cognitive toolkits they're using to build an argument can be far more important than just simply the letter grade. So across a wide variety of literature, this 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, these thousands of hours of setting a deliberate goal, a specific goal, obtaining immediate feedback, and concentrating on the technique as much as outcome, is consistently showing higher and higher levels of performance as you increase the number of hours in doing that. Again, going back to that idea of finding flow, doing something that's very hard for you, but something that you're very good at, then entails, if you're going to be in that upper right quadrant, living at the edge of your competence. It means that this flow life, which is has a lot of positive emotions, is also, though, going to entail a lot of risk, which may also generate anxiety. So going back to the discussion about how to manage anxiety and recognizing those symptoms so that you can take care of yourself, you can make sure that those basic needs are being met. But this really all belies the question of what's worth the time and energy and focus required to develop that kind of expertise. There's a large literature on trying to figure out what is your mission, what is your calling, how do you, in the process I'll use to describe this is discernment. A great quote I love by Rabbi Zusia said, "In the coming world, they will not ask me, why were you not more Moses? They will ask me, why were you not Zusia?" I think this is really an important thing. It's very easy in academia to compare yourself to feel imposter syndrome. A huge number of colleagues, when I have conversations about issues in academia, are talking about that sense of not being an imposter, of I'm now supposed to be the expert. Like, what does that mean? I remember when I was a young lawyer and I had spent months researching this very arcane bankruptcy issue. And I went to the partner that I was working for and I said, "So did I get this right?" And he said, "Well, I don't know, you're the expert. You've been working on this for months. Did you get it right?" That shock at 25 that I was the expert on something, I'd spent way more time thinking about this obscure issue than anybody else had, was just really difficult to get a grip with. And so rather than comparing ourselves to others, focusing on who are we? The deeper vocational question in this book that's described, Let Your Life Speak, the deeper vocational question is not what ought I to do with my life. It is the more elemental and demanding question of who am I? What is my nature? The idea that we focus on who we are rather than on the things that we are going to do, I think is really critical. In developing my own mission statement at a certain point, I realized that I've been thinking of it as a statement of teleology, of what were my ends. In the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he talks about what would you want written on your tombstone? And I think that teleological, that kind of like, what are my ends kind of thing, had started to infect my thinking in a way that wasn't as healthy for me, because it felt like, again, a comparison to the Darren I should be in some way. And instead, the recognition of the who am I? What is my nature? Am I the person that I want to be? In what ways am I? When am I that person I want to be? Enabled me to really shift the feelings and the reactions, the relationship I had to a sense of purpose, and to the recognition that I was living out that mission I wanted. So to discern your purpose, I would advocate for a 3-part process. Discerning, the first step being quieting your environment, letting go of the expectations, again, in this kind of meditative process, letting go of the expectations that others have put on you, that you've put on yourself, the pressures of the tenure committee, or the pressures of the job market, or the voices that we hear all around us, letting all of that get quiet. Again, using the meditative practices, the mindfulness that we've talked about previously. Second, listening to your body, your mind, your heart, your soul, yourself in time, space, and your hopes, paying attention to where are the moments in your life where you felt most you? What were the environments that you were in where you were feeling like you were most thriving, where you were most excited, where that positive energy was there, where you just wanted to do that? I realized, listening to an audio tape of myself when I was 7, sent this audio tape to my grandparents, because back in the day, phone calls were expensive, and listened to 7-year-old Darren explaining to my grandfather about my experiments growing corn. He was a corn farmer in Iowa, and about some deep philosophical thoughts I was having about Star Wars, because that movie had just come out. And I realized that, listening back to that there had always been a part of me that was a teacher, that was a researcher, and those 2 key elements had been consistent in my work as a lawyer. One of my proudest moments was when a inmate in Folsom Prison asked me one more legal question at the end of our conversation. This is a guy with an 8th grade education who'd been in gangs for many years, and he asked me a question, and I said, "Well, we've just gone over what the legal standards are. What do you think about this?" And he said, "Oh, well, yeah, I guess they weren't being deliberately indifferent to a serious medical need, so that wouldn't qualify as a violation of my 8th Amendment rights." And I was so excited, because this person, in that environment, I had been able to teach them a very sophisticated legal concept that took me a long time to kind of get my head around. And that teaching, going along with it, paying attention to each of those elements across the span of my life, allowed me to see really clearly that teaching, research, these were key parts of who I am at my core, and to then reflect those in my mission statement. Listening to your environment, to the people you admire, to your culture, to your faith, using that as information to tell you about your values, who you are. And then finally, the 3rd step, doing the things that you believe to be your truth as a practice. Seeing, in psychology, they'll call this behavioral experiments. Does this thing work? If you think that this is your mission, try that out for a while. Does it in fact work. And then again, going through that quieting, listening, and doing iteratively, working towards an identification of different roles in your life and the different goals you have, the nature of who you are in each of those different roles. What is the essence of that? And articulating that down so that you can develop a mission statement as a result. Many missions, many of the highest callings can lead a person to loss, suffering, and death. Viktor Frankl, talking about this, says that you can survive any what if there's a why. Again, building on thoughts that Nietzsche and others had had in the past. This idea that Viktor Frankl noticed people survived concentration camps. And he was surprised by the people who were surviving in the concentration camp with him were the people who had purpose. And this book, Man's Sense for Meaning, another recommended reading. Identifying your mission can entail a very long process of discernment. Our business school had a mission statement up on its window for a while that was the most bland, obvious, useless kind of thing that just, it seemed like it had been written quickly by a committee over the course of a weekend, thinking they needed to have a mission statement for a university rather than something that was really reflective of the particular characteristics of that institution. My mission statement, I think, fits me like a glove. I wrote it about 20 years ago as I was having a bit of an identity crisis in that transition from being a lawyer to being an academic and really trying to figure out why had I sacrificed a legal career for this, the challenges of academia. And again, I've come back to that mission statement when I've been at moments of crisis, and the payoff has been tremendous. Because when you've identified your goals for each of those roles in your life, the payoff is tremendous. You will develop a sense of expertise, excellence, and you can live in flow. So I would encourage you to be thinking of, why are you here? We in academia don't get paid a lot of money. We work really high hours. We develop extreme skill levels at all sorts of different things. We're asked to be pulled in a million different directions. Why do this? And if you haven't really started wrestling with that question, I would encourage you to do that, because going back again and again to the reasons that I've chosen to make the sacrifices I have as an academic, it's very clear to me that I'm in the right place, and I'm very grateful for this, even when I face challenges that are quite difficult. This connects then finally with the PERMA model of well-being. Again, one of the founders of positive psychology, Martin Seligman, his research, he's argued, led him to this conclusion of that well-being can be thought of as a combination of positive emotions, engagement, relationships with authentic connections, again, that sense of meaning, and then finally a sense of achievement and accomplishment as you've moved through the tasks that you've wanted. I wanted to end by just talking a little bit about my own personal workflow. When I sit down to work, I spend 10 to 20 minutes at least in mindfulness meditation, again, using the Calm app. Doing the daily Calm thing gives me a constant refresh of a new type of meditation to do each day. This allows me to pay attention to myself, to feel my feelings, because again, that idea of productivity being connected to emotion management rather than just time management, feeling the feelings, having an attention to the inner core of myself. And then a 20-minute Pomodoro of journaling, part of that being a core dump where I just write down whatever has come in my mind during the context of that meditation, thoughts about what's going on in the last day, or what I have thinking about for the next week, or whatever other kind of issues come up. Whatever comes up, I put it into that. And then I go through in the second half of my journaling period for the next 10 minutes, thinking through the 5 elements of my life and writing specifically about what I'm going to do in each of those. Stephen Covey, again, with part of that sharpening the saw, recommends that one of those 5 roles has to be sharpening the saw, taking care of yourself, putting gas in the gas tank, taking care of you. Again, the idea on the airplane, we're always hearing you've got to put your own mask on before you take time to put the mask on others, because if you don't put your own mask on before helping others, you're simply not going to survive, and then they won't make it either. That logic of taking care of yourself with putting the mask on to make sure your airflow is going before you help the person next to you is critical, and that sharpening the saw element reflects that. Then I go right into my own academic writing. I go into the things that I care about most in my academic writing. I realized a pattern I had was very often to respond to emails or to answer questions from students, to deal with those other parties, to put the sand in instead of the stones. And it's been really great to get that regular pattern of putting the big rocks in first, so that I know I've done my daily writing. There's a great book by a psychologist on how to write a lot, and the title, How to Write a Lot, and works through a lot of myths and basically says, though, that if you're writing consistently every day, it turns out that that regular writing practice is far more effective than big binges of writing. And I know many of us have a tendency to clear off our calendar for a day and just write. The research suggests that that daily writing practice is far more effective. And then, as part of the reward cue, in addition to the timer going off at the end of every Pomodoro, writing down in an Excel spreadsheet, like how many Pomodoros I did, and what those tasks were that I had allocated to each of those Pomodoros. Some of my favorite tools are Pomodoros, using accountability partners, so talking with friends that are also struggling with work issues or have deadlines, so I can say, hey, today I'm going to do this many Pomodoros on this tasks, and then bookending that so that I call them before the task, especially if it's something I avoid. I don't always use accountability partners, but I find them very, very effective. Like I mentioned, the smoothie test, if I'm feeling like I'm just exhausted, being able to refuel myself quickly. I also keep a research journal and a teaching journal separately. The research journal allows me to just put academic ideas into that and get them out of my head, and to play with ideas in a way that doesn't have the pressure of kind of formal academic writing. And similarly, I keep a teaching journal, just a reflection of what's gone right and wrong in the classroom. What did I try to solve it? What other ideas might I brainstorm? All of those have been effective tools. So where we've been, we've talked about knowing your needs, managing your time and emotions, finding flow, the habit loop, and then finally finding your mission. So I hope you've enjoyed this hour-long journey with me, and I'll be happy to take any questions. So if you just want to raise your hand and